I think so much of where brands have resonance is when they're unified, when you feel like you're getting hit from every direction in all of your senses, that sight, that smell, it's everything, whether it's the feel, the sheets, what you see when you hear, when you walk into the room, what the music is playing, the view, everything about it, you just keep getting hit and hit and hit and hit with the same things over and over again. That is that like 4-star outdoor adventure experience brand that is Trailborn. And people don't notice things that we like have spent a huge amount of time on. And then they notice things, that are even smaller than that. And so just trying to catch every guest in their moment in the things that they notice and using that to shape their experience and just remind them of kind of the pillars of who we are around design, around being the center of gravity, around being your kind of field guide and your guide in these markets, I think is where you can really sort of start to create a brand.
Ben, I'm super excited to have this conversation because you are someone that I've been following pretty closely. You've been doing a lot of very interesting things in the hospitality space. We're going to get to all of it. But where I wanted to start first is your first introduction to real estate. Why did you even get fascinated by real estate? Why do you like real estate? Where did this whole thing start?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jake. Thanks for having me on. My introduction to real estate was in kind of a bunch of different ways. I would say my fascination and fixation with entrepreneurship is sort of equal to my fascination and fixation with real estate. I would say as an entrepreneur, I always had that feeling that I wanted to be a CEO, start a business, and that I could excel in that role, or at least try to. As it relates to real estate itself, I started my career at Goldman Sachs as an analyst in the investment banking division. And, you don't really get a ton of exposure to real estate itself as an operator in the sense that I am today. When I went out to work for TBG after Goldman, there was a bunch of different things that we worked on, and we looked at kind of real estate in all different shapes and sizes. We were buying non-performing loans. We were buying hotels in Vegas out of bankruptcy. We were, starting data center platforms in Australia. But what I really enjoyed was the company building alongside the unlevered value creation. And I'd always felt from a young age that there was something very difficult and complex about unlevered value creation, particularly, 10 years ago when rates were extremely low, effectively zero, and building these companies and raising capital to do it and repositioning assets or building assets from scratch was just easier. But seeing people in action who I was working with and just fortunate to be around, seeing them build and create was just so fascinating to me. And I liked the energy and the reward and the challenge of the complexity around that. And I just started to gravitate towards that stuff, kind of the more just unlevered value creation plays versus financial engineering plays. And by the way, financial engineering plays are great plays, often the most attractive risk-adjusted plays. I was fascinated by stuff where you're taking a little bit more risk and you're getting paid in an outsized way for that.
So in the context of kind of earlier in your career, when you were starting, when maybe rates were zero, money was free, to today, when money is definitely not free and interest rates are higher, how has unlevered value creation changed for you in the space in which you compete, if at all?
I think, I would say my understanding of unlevered value creation has changed as I've kind of started to mature more as a professional, as a leader, but also just the environment has changed. I think 10 to 15 years ago, there was a playbook, especially at the institutional level, to buy stabilized assets with inexpensive leverage and to scale that and to earn promotes off of that, which was a very attractive risk-adjusted play. That play is gone, which pushes the world into more niche operationally intensive asset classes where you have to really do the hard work and the grunt work to earn the right to sit down and have a conversation to raise capital and build a business. And so I would say, number one, obviously, interest rates, as you mentioned, have changed. I also think the world has broadened its horizons, especially in the institutional real estate world, around kind of venturing into more niche asset classes, as a lot of those niche asset classes, like self-storage, for example, has just become more institutional and has become institutionalized over time. And, cap rates have tightened, the number of operators grows, institutional capital, flows of capital move into those spaces, and you see a lot of value creation from that. And I think, when we spend time on outdoor hospitality is kind of a little bit of the beginning of that. We're going into markets where millions of people are going, where you really can't build hotels anymore. People are looking for a 4-star product that they can't find. And it's very difficult to find and buy these properties. It's difficult to renovate them. It's difficult to operate them. And our vision was, let's create a platform that can go look people in the eye and say, we can do a good job at those things, which are hard to do. And as a result, target kind of low double-digit unlevered yield cost, which is hard to do in the real estate business. But if you can get there and you can do it consistently, you've created a machine with a team of people who are really committed to that and understand that in a unique way that allows you to kind of raise capital and grow and start to earn the right to have bigger conversations, work on bigger assets, raise bigger pools of capital.
There's an infrastructure and there's a lot of hard work and there's things that are out of your control. When you were sitting at Goldman Sachs doing investment banking, there's, I think, a lot of financial engineering. Where did you kind of learn the part where you had to do the hard work or learn about operating businesses, or you had to build stuff and you couldn't just type it into Excel or Word and it would automatically happen? Did that come at TPG, or did you figure it out later? How did you like get that piece? Because, I always joke that bankers and people just sitting behind a keyboard don't really get the pressure or the things that we have to deal with all the time. And, just because you type it out on a spreadsheet doesn't mean it actually plays out that way.
Yeah, I was one of those people who you're describing. I was exactly that. And I think that I had a feeling that there was an ocean of unknown out there. But how deep that ocean was, I think, was a surprise to me, both to the positive and to the negative. I think the energy that I get from walking into an office every day and knowing that this is our company, we are driving this forward, we control outcomes, is a really beautiful thing. Having said that, driving those outcomes is really hard, right? When you're
Yep.
not the 800-pound gorilla, as I'm sure you know. And it's really something. It's a really important point because I think it rewires you to have to do the work to do anything. When we first started, I was buying toilet paper to put in our office, right? I mean, that's what you do, because you just do it. Some people aren't cut out for that. Some people don't like it, which is totally okay. I used to naively think that that was the only path. I don't think that's the only path. I think there's so many different paths for different types of people who have different passions and preferences around how they want to kind of shape their lives and how they want to shape their interests in their profession. But it was the right fit for me. And I get energy from it, as I know a lot of other entrepreneurs who I talk to do, around doing all of the stuff that brings something to life and moves something forward in a way that really creates value for others. I was listening to an interview with Bezos the other day. He was talking about there should not be a chart of wealth created for yourself, but the amount of wealth you created for others. I think it's really powerful. And that's just part of the game. That's part of the game that we play. And I think winning and winning with other people who have trusted you with their capital, I mean, there's nothing more sensational and fun than that to us. But I think, the very specific type of skill set that's constantly evolving when you're an entrepreneur, there's an excitement to that, there's an unpredictability to that, there's huge complexity and challenge to that I've really enjoyed.
What was going on in the world in your life that made you want to transition to be an entrepreneur and to get into the hotel business? Both very hard things.
Both reckless decisions to make. There was not sort of one thing that really kind of happened in my life. I mean, from the moment I can remember, I loved business. I wanted to understand everything about business. I would see an HVAC unit on the top of the building and say, where the hell that got there? Who installs that? Does the same person who installs it service it? How do they make money? And I was thinking that when I was just a young person. Ever since I can remember, I always wanted to be an entrepreneur and start something. There just came a moment where I almost couldn't sit down in my chair. I just had such entrepreneurial energy and I wanted to go do it. And frankly, prove myself that I could do it, right? Because deep down, I think if you're realistic, there's a possibility you fail. And it's not a low possibility, just statistically. And I wanted to know whether I could do it. I thought that I could do it, but I wasn't totally sure. And I wanted to go give it a try. And it was kind of building energy over time to the point where I had a great relationship with the people I worked for, and they had given me a chance, as a young person in their business that had grown enormously, and I had benefited from that. And I didn't want to be halfway in and halfway out. So I left with, without a company, without a business partner, without a capital raise, without an asset. which I wouldn't recommend to people generally because it makes the path harder. But I felt that it was worth it to, maintain the relationships that I had with the folks that I worked with, and them knowing that I was, creating an outcome that's financially damaging myself just to preserve that relationship. I think it was meaningful and, has helped me out to this day.
Was hospitality always the thing that you wanted to do when you left? Or did you go through this exploration trying to figure what asset class you wanted to be in?
Yeah, I had always felt hospitality was extremely compelling and interesting because it was hard and complicated, and the best made a lot of money, and the mediocre and not great lost a lot of money. I just found that dynamic to be very intriguing and not totally unique to hospitality, but more exaggerated and almost dramatic in hospitality.
Yep.
And, I was sort of hovering in and around hospitality, trying to find an opportunity where I saw a thesis that was simple to explain and understand and hard to execute. Hard to execute, just meaning that there had work to be done and no one had really quite figured it out yet. And I spent my whole life in the outdoors and was up in Estes Park, Colorado, spending some time in Rocky Mountain National Park, and had a bit of moment at a Best Western on a Tuesday night, paying way more than I should have, where I said, there's something interesting to do here. And then spent the next year on the road, effectively figuring out, is this a business that works? Is it executable? Is it scalable? Right. Because what can happen in the real estate business, and it happens too often, I feel, is people have a good idea and a good business plan around one asset. But it really, to make the juice worth the squeeze, especially in today's world where, you know, operators and even capital allocators are getting squeezed in every which way on every different fee, you really have to create a scalable business to, make the juice worth the squeeze and make it a worthwhile business endeavor that you can commit yourself to versus committing yourself to an asset.
What did you learn as you were traveling around over the past year in figuring out whether this could be one asset or many assets? And how did the business plan come about from that journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about our business is that the idea and the concept is completely unchanged, but the execution of that evolves and is refined every single day, right? Because we're constantly learning tiny little things that allow us to iterate and get better and better and better and better. On the year that I spent on the road with my business partner Mike, we spent a lot of time together in a lot of garbage hotels all over the country, really just trying to again answer this question: is this a good business model? How do we get our hand as many P&Ls as humanly possible? How do we understand these owners? Will they actually sell to us at reasonable prices? Is this actionable? And are there enough locations out there, not just national parks, but also beaches, lake towns, wine countries, ski resorts, where we can really build something that we care about and that our team can care about and get excited about? I think one of the things that we realized later is that not only do you need to build a scalable business to be focused so that you're not all over the place, which I think is extremely powerful and important, but also as you build a scalable business, you can, bring your team into the economic benefit of it in a way as the business gets bigger in a way that's really compelling for them, and make sure that you're attracting and retaining best in world talent. Talent is just the single most important thing. It's the single most important thing in the hospitality business. It's also the single most important thing in the investment business. I just think it's the single most important thing in life. It's talked about a lot and almost not talked about enough. But, scaling that business and figuring out and seeing, I would say certain parts of America that I had never seen and so enjoyed. I had never been to Big Bear. I'd never been to Lake of the Ozarks. I'd never been to Grand Canyon. These really extraordinary destinations that, we hadn't spent a ton of time in, that really highlight how geographically spectacular this country is and how much this country has to offer. It really is incredible when you think about what natural wonders are here and the diversity of those natural wonders. And I think we take it for granted how really kind of special this country is from that perspective.
I think we're at a huge transition point in hospitality where the hotels that were built maybe in the 80s were built for these big conventions, like business travelers on the road. And then those were eventually branded and commoditized in the 90s and early to mid 2000s. And now we're going into a very different era. And obviously the precursor to this was like the launch of Ian Traeger and Barry Sternlicht and Andre Balas and all these boutique hotels, you saw a white space. Can you kind of, in that context of how hospitality has evolved, explain what the white space is and how Trailborn kind of is filling that and what the strategy is for Trailborn?
Sure. So, as it relates to kind of the context of the history of hospitality that you sort of just mentioned, I think what we've seen in markets where the math does not match the anecdote being, I've never heard of that place, the math being some of the most extraordinary real estate fundamentals we've seen in terms of supply demand. What we've seen is that those markets, these what we would call iconic outdoor destination markets, so national park gateway towns, beach towns, lake towns, ski resorts, and wine country, all over the United States, they were low RevPAR markets for a very long time. And as a result, the Best Westerns, the Comfort Inns, the big publicly traded companies had their flags there. And what happened is, the power of compounding is pretty extraordinary. And when you grow RevPAR at somewhere between 4 and 8% a year, you start to hit a point where RevPAR gets to that level where what really the visionaries of hospitality who you mentioned, who we respect and admire enormously, have created, there is room for a version of that in these markets. And you got to be really careful about how you buy it, what you spend to create it. And, creating what exists in New York City in the Grand Canyon does not make sense, but there are things to learn and there's connective tissue around the boutique product that fits the Grand Canyon and draws on some of the influences of the enormous momentum behind those luxury boutique in New York City and LA and some of these great hospitality centers of the world. That's how I would kind of contextualize it within the history of hospitality, so to speak, and where hospitality has evolved. I think the bigger brands are starting to pay attention to these markets in a way that they had not before. So while RevPAR started to hit a point in many of these markets where that yield the cost on the boutique build out effectively now starts to work, you also have the big brands start to say, okay, there's real growth in these markets from a RevPAR perspective and a key count perspective. As it relates to the strategy of Trailborn and sort of how that connects, we exist to create 10, 12% stabilized yield to cost. Every single thing that we do is dedicated around that, because if you do that, the rest sort of takes care of itself. Interest rates will come up, interest rates will go down, cap rates will expand, cap rates will compress. But if you've got that 10, 12% unlevered yield to cost and you use leverage in a modest and appropriate way for the hospitality business, which I think is often kind of forgotten about, and we've seen that through many, many cycles in both hospitality and real estate, you can really kind of create quite an interesting investment product, I would say, where you can buy a 3-star, convert it to a 4-star, and make money by buying it at the right price off market, by operating yourself, by plugging into our brand in Trailborn, the Marriott system, and by doing all the design and construction yourself. So, I mean, listen, it's a ton of work. It takes a ton of people, and it's hugely cross-disciplinary. It's one of the most beautiful things of hospitality. You use your mind around economics and finance and design and creative and operations. It's sort of this amazing industry that combines all of those for better or for worse. So, people like us love it. That's why we're here. But, that really is a strategy of Trailborn, is to go to these markets where we see that supply demand mismatch, where supply is largely fixed and low quality and demand is growing and durable and is really sustained through everything the world has thrown at us. My view is that the world is almost accelerating in terms of how chaotic and volatile it is. I think people sometimes expect the world to cool off. I just don't expect that to happen the way the world is constructed today, both geopolitically, domestic politics, energy, just the way we've constructed our world today. I think it's very delicate, more delicate, I think, than we appreciated. And when you start to mess with different levers and different pieces of it, whether that's the current presidential administration, whether that's, the defense secretary, whatever it is, that has real implications. And I think we're starting to feel that. And so the chaos and volatility unravel. And what we tried to create was a business where we didn't have to focus on that as much, where, you've got Riceville Beach as an example, where Trailborn Surf and Sound is kind of the North Carolina beach destination for Raleigh-Durham folks primarily. Those people are going to Riceville Beach really no matter what. Now, how long they go and how much they're willing to pay, of course, can vary over time. But Riceville Beach, there's 2 hotels there. There's a Holiday Inn Resort. There's us, Trailborn Surf and Sound. and you've got millions of people coming across that bridge and they want to be on that beach every year. And so it creates this dynamic where hospitality has priced from a risk perspective is a little bit different. We just think about everything in terms of supply demand. So the supply demand equation in New York City, where a lot of smart people have made a lot of money and done a fantastic job, but the supply demand equation is really complicated, right? Supply, there's constant fluctuations based on, regulatory and zoning and conversion of multi into hotel or vice versa, whatever it might be. And on the demand side, it's international, is it business, is it kind of, it's just very, very complicated. In our markets, it's just very simple, right? Which is that people want to go into the outdoors, they want to experience with their friends and family. And we've found in our work is that a lot of the people with more resources than anyone else in the world, their memories and their favorite memories are not the most luxurious memories. So to speak more closely, like, it's not staying at Amanjiri necessarily. Not staying at Amanjiri is one of the most beautiful hotels in the world, hands down, incredible. But a lot of times you talk to people and their memory is with their grandson at the Crab Shack in Cape Cod, right? And what we try to do when people walk into our hotels is just take a shot at creating that memory. And we're going to fail a bunch just because you can't expect to do that every single time. But if we have a product, an experience and a hospitality and a training and just a group of people who care about that and understand that, you can take a pretty good shot at that every time someone walks into the hotel and do the best we can.
So when you look at luxury travel, like far and away, it's outperformed all the other classes of hotels in the past 5 years, and it's still growing. And, it's obvious to me that those people aren't going to trade down. They're going to sacrifice other things in their life to keep staying in those hotels. But when you're talking in the 3 to 4 star space, okay, if you experienced a Best Western and it was getting crazy rates, what are you doing at Trailborn to get an even higher rate? And are there enough people and customers that have the taste or the appreciation for whatever it is you're doing? And I want you to explain what you're doing to pay more for it, because it seems like they do. Otherwise, you just buy it right and leave it as a Best Western. But you're doing something more, and you must think that there's enough people going to that place that will choose your hotel over the Best Western or over the Holiday Inn because they get something more from it. So, how did you think about that, and what are those things that you're doing in the hotel?
It's a great question. And the art of our business is figuring this out in our underwriting, because in some cases, Jake, what you're saying is actually true, which is that the Best Western is the best product for that market. And that's not a market that we should be in.
Right.
But there are hundreds of markets that we see out there where you can buy the Best Western and you can operate it a bit differently, redesign it, and broaden the experience. I'm going to talk about exactly what that means. So when people walk in, what they see, what they hear, what they smell, what they feel, what they talk to the front desk agent about, the email they get that shows them the long way and the short way, and to stop at Colorado Cherry Pie, and here's a Spotify playlist to listen to. And oh, by the way, here are the 5 experiences you need to do in Rocky Mountain National Park, or here are the 4 hikes in Yosemite that you don't know about, that you feel like you're talking to us and we've been there for 20 years and that you're getting those hikes. It's those hundreds of little details. And when you walk in the room, the Tivoli radio playing the local radio station that has, country music from a California artist, whatever it might be, we're creating that really comprehensive product that is driven by design, that's driven by people, and that's driven by digital product as well. That really creates something unique and different that just feels a whole step above what the Best Western is. And the way we like to underwrite these is creating a product and having a budget to create a product that's 3 times better, but only really charging kind of 30 to 40% more.
So let's talk about how you find one of these hotels that you're going to convert, that you're going to renovate. What are the things that are really important? Like, if you kind of think about it as a funnel, like, here are all the properties we could buy. Like, how do you narrow it down to the ones that you've bought and that are on your buy list?
Yeah, I think where we kind of spend the most time is around, assets where we can, deploy more than $25 million of equity, where we see an opportunity to renovate and reposition into a 4-star product. And in certain cases, I mean, total project costs, as you know well, is kind of how we think about everything. And when we're able to buy something from a distressed seller who's in trouble at another asset, so we're buying this asset at a discounted price, but we got to put more money into it. It's all about kind of the total project cost. I think when you build these platforms, you have to be able to pull different levers and different magnitudes, right? So in some cases, you may want to you may buy a 100-key hotel and you're building 50 keys from scratch, new build, to create that yield. And those 100 keys are actually like pretty fully baked. And you're actually only spending 5,000 a key to do small, OS&E updates to those rooms. Or it can be a 200-key hotel where it's being operated in a way that we think makes very little sense. We think margins can go from 24 to 29. And we think plugging in Trailborn in the Marriott system will, raise RevPAR without a complete, renovation, maybe with a few FF&E pieces replaced by, 15%. We think that can be that can be really powerful. And it's just the magnitude of those levers. Sometimes you got to pull the development lever much harder based on the project. Sometimes you got to pull the operational lever much harder. Sometimes you have to pull the brand and experience in programming, kind of the non-built experience in programming, whether it's kind of taking an old game room and turning it into a program bowling alley where you can, buy drinks, whether that's, doing a partnership with a ski mountain nearby to kind of drive traffic there and having the vans leave every 7 minutes, like whatever it might be, you just have to pull those levers in different magnitudes, but you have to have access to all those levers. And that takes work, right? Because people talk about those levers, but you have to have people and process and experience and have made mistakes at pulling all those levers to really kind of get it right. And to be in a position where, those levers actually work. And you can underwrite them with confidence.
Can you use one of your projects in one of your recent hotels? With maybe it's Wrightsville, maybe it's another one, where you kind of walk us through the acquisition and kind of the creative process to get to where you wanted to land. We'll talk about the operations later, but just kind of converting something that was, nothing close to what you've done. And design is really, I mean, for those that haven't seen, I mean, you should go to Ben's website and Trailborn, because the design and the branding and just everything they do is super tuned and really, really, really spot on. But I'd love to kind of learn more about the creative process going from nothing to something special
Yeah.
through one
Yeah.
of the projects that you've done.
My old boss used to have this phrase, creating something from nothing is the most powerful thing on earth. And it really is. And I have to say, when I first started working with him when I was 25, I didn't really understand what he meant. I was sitting behind a spreadsheet, as you sort of referenced before. And I really, in the hospitality business, we live that. Oh, so maybe we could talk about Wrightsville Beach, which I mentioned earlier, which is Trailborn Surf and Sound. We bought a hotel called the Blockade Runner from the Baggett family, Bill and Mary Baggett, who are really wonderful people, who had owned it with their two other siblings for almost 70 years. And we bought it from them, and we renovated and repositioned the asset effectively from a 3-star resort to a 4-star resort. I think it's important in that case to flag, like, we had the bones there. So that asset goes from surf to sound. We have a commercial dock on one side that sits on the water. We're on the beach on the other. So when you see this asset pre-renovation, saying, okay, we have something to work with here. We have something really spectacular. And now we have to figure out within our budget, which was in that case $17 million. And we completed that construction project in 4 months, which was sort of a beast to get done. But, that project, and that's just construction, by the way, of course, pre-development takes much longer than that. But that project, from a renovation perspective, we had to go in there and say, okay, we need to find the right architect, the right interior designer who understands the beast of North Carolina, right? This has to feel one of one. Every Trailborn is unique, and it, makes our life much more complicated and much harder, but is what makes this brand special, in the sense that every hotel feels one of one, but has that consistency, across. And so we're hiring different architects and designers for each project who really understand that location. And when we start, when we go hard on a deposit, we start like the day after. So as every day we can beat that IRR clock.
Yep.
We're working towards that, but we're sitting down with our architects and interior designers. We're interviewing before we go hard, and then hire when we do go hard on the deposit, and say, okay, here's the kind of the constraints of how the Trailborn brand works. Here's what it looks and feels like. Here are all of our other properties. We need to work with you guys to create this version on the beach of North Carolina, have that boutique product You have to walk in. It's the music you hear. It's the scent we have. It's the way the lobby's lit. It's the way it's designed that feels like I have arrived on the beach, right? And I think, in that renovation, we were very focused. I think we generally are focused on the public spaces. Just that sense of arrival is so important. The most meaningful thing we did was the bar was in the back of the restaurant and we pulled it up so that you could see it right when you walk in. It's important to us that people see it and say, I'm here. I can go have a drink. It's the most simple human instinct. And that's what we wanted. We installed another bar outside and built it out a little bit called Blockade Surf Bar as an ode to the old hotel to add to that. As it relates though to our projects, on my point on public spaces are so important. They drive the feel of a property. They drive kind of the first impression of the guest, which when you're dealing in the 4-star product with a mass affluent customer, the rooms are not going to drive the long-term memory. It's going to be the public spaces and the programming, right? And so whether it's a sunset cruise, whether it's, a paddleboard lesson, whether it's surfing class, whether it's a camp program for the kids, it's the stuff that is in and around it's the non-built plus the built that happens in the public spaces, whether it's on the beach or the lawns or in the lobby. They really kind of drive our product and what people look for and feel, and also to remember.
All right, there's a bunch of questions I have. So on something like that, on a project like that, what were the things that you learned that are must-haves, and what were the things that you were like, we didn't need that, or we could have done that a little bit better?
So we'll get really granular here.
Let's do it.
One thing that we did in the rooms, which I think is fairly common now, but we were undecided on, is there was a really old tile on the floor that, if you just saw this tile, you'd be like, oh, okay, this is that 60s vintage. And what we did, rather than ripping up all the tile, is we basically covered the entire tile with a really beautiful rug that totally takes your eye off the tile, costs a fraction of what replacing the tile was. And I think we did a really nice job with that. I think that worked really well, and I would do that again.
Yep.
Bathrooms, which are a constant debate in this office around how much people care.
Every hotel office.
Yeah, it's just like it's really, we've got a lot of really committed and passionate people, which we're fortunate to have, and we're just constantly debating. Are the new shower pans total garbage? Can they be workable? Are they not? What we did was we removed the shower door in these showers, and we have a nib wall with a glass piece on top, and we didn't make it long enough. And so there's some water that comes out. And so the floor in the bathroom is more wet than we would like. We're never going to do that again.
What would you do in replace of that then?
We would do a shower pan with a closing door.
Yeah.
Keep the floor more dry.
Yeah. I mean, the look is so good, and designers always want you to have no door, but you don't have to clean the room.
One thing that we have done everywhere from the beginning is have art that really is an ode to the history of the hotel. I think when you bring in a new name to really understand and dive deep into the history of the hotel and have art that is an ode to that, I think is really important. We've done everything from finding matchboxes on eBay from 30 years ago to, finding old mementos from the old owners and turning them into art. There's lots of kind of fun, interesting ways to do that.
Another thing I heard you say, which I kind of want to double click on, because there are other groups that do this in-house and don't work with outside people, but it seems like on each project you engage, maybe there's a consistent theme of interior designers, but you're working with third parties. Like you have design resources in-house, but they're not doing the full design. Why did you make that choice versus maybe saying, hey, I'm going to hire a couple designers, we're going to design all of our own projects, and we're not going to work with anyone, we're just going to be vertically integrated in everything that we do?
Yeah. So I think we've evolved on this, as we build a company, but I think we've been fairly consistent on having a view on where third parties really break down and where third parties can really excel and where you get real return on cost. So for example, we have an office in Park City where our entire development construction team is. We don't use third-party project managers. We don't use third-party project or development managers. We do all of that in-house. So all development is in-house and construction oversight. That is a place where we've just seen so many issues, communication breakdown, third parties not be focused and creates real issues. We want to own. I want to know what's going on at our properties every single day, whether it's under construction or operating. As it relates to the third parties that you mentioned, architects and interior designers, I think there's sort of two, and people have done this different ways. I think our view is that there's two problems with that. One is that bringing architects and interior designers in house starts to remove the discipline of budget, is what we've kind of generally seen. And that really scares us. We are an investment firm first and are in the business of these 10, 12% stabilized and labor costs. I think once you start getting carried away with that, you have people sitting in this office saying like, this is what we need to do and really not concerned with budget. And that's not because they're bad designers. That's just because that's not designers' jobs to focus on budget. But the natural tension of an architect and interior designer with our developers, I think, is a really healthy tension to have. We have design and creative resources in-house, but it is for all the digital product and all the OS&E, which is where we felt that third parties just could not deliver. But for an architect and interior designer, we just felt that building out that team in-house was going to be very expensive and potentially lead us down some dangerous paths and kind of start to chip away at the discipline we feel that we have around investment decisions. And then there's the very typical kind of other third parties on a hotel project, whether it's procurement, which we don't do in-house, or, any kind of variety of things on the creative and delivery side of the project itself. But everything that sits from a digital perspective, when you look at our website, we do that all in-house. From an OS&E, if you go get some of this merch that's behind me, this is all designed by us in-house. We couldn't find third parties who could do it in a way that was at our pace. And pace is really important. Like pace, intensity is such a critical piece to these projects. The thing that I really am wary of is when things start to slow down. And slowing down means that people are losing focus, they're losing interest, their incentives maybe are not right. Whether they're about to, give you a change order from an architectural set, since they spend more time than what they initially claimed they would spend, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And so this never-ending battle with developers. But really slowing projects down, I think, is very dangerous. Now, if you go too fast, you get sloppy and you make mistakes, which you don't want to do. But there's kind of that right pace where it's a little bit further than your comfort zone, but not too far, where you can really start to get these projects done and get them right and start to identify problems quickly and be talking openly and kind of make sure everyone's very focused.
Did you have to learn the hard way on the timing side or the budget side? Like, how did you start to kind of figure these things out? Was it actually the early ones were a challenge, now you're figuring it out? Or did you kind of know this ahead of the game and were always very mindful of it?
Yeah, I mean, if anyone in my seat tells you they didn't learn the hard way in every single area of their business, they're lying. I mean, it's crazy. There's no way to avoid it. It's part of the journey. It's part of like how you figure this stuff out. And I would say like the key is learning the hard way, but not having that have huge negative impacts on your business. That's the whole key to surviving and building these businesses, right? And, in some cases we had decisions that we made that were not the right decisions that had larger impacts than others, but just kind of keeping the course. I think so we learned the hard way in every single area of the business. As it relates to third parties specifically on the development and construction side, I think early on before we had our office in Park Cities, we have our office here in downtown the West Village, New York, and then we have an office in Park City. But that Park City office did not exist, and we did not have our own development and construction team built out to the extent that we have it today. And we were using some third parties for construction oversight. Total mistake, right? Like to be able to know and to call our team, who I trust and are very good at what they do, and say, what is happening today, right now? Are we on track? Are we off track? And why? To be able to understand that quickly and every week without getting and I'm sure, you have seen your fair share of the sort of like non-answer. There is nothing, I do not do well in the non-answer sort of purgatory world that does
Yep.
not, I don't fit with that very well. I just like to understand what's happening, and I have no issue asking questions. But that was one of the areas that we learned the hard way. And I think that construction oversight, what most people call project management, having that in house has been a huge unlock for us.
I always like to talk about how people run their businesses and how they run their meetings and stuff like that. So you have two sides of your business. We've talked a lot about kind of the operational side. We'll get into the investment side, but let's take the investment side or the operational side. Like, what are the weekly meetings you have? What are the monthly meetings you have to keep the pulse on the business? Because you have properties in multiple states. For those that don't know, a hotel is like literally having your own business. So If you have 4 hotels, it's having 4 completely separate businesses. So how do you keep the pulse on that? How do you keep the pulse on your acquisitions and on the development and construction side?
Yeah. So I think reporting is so important in an early stage business. And, we're a little bit past that now, but it's really hard to find the bandwidth when you're just starting a business to really go through reporting. I think the most common misconception of reporting is that it's for the people you're sending the report to. Reporting is actually for the person sending the report to have a very clear way. I have a saying, attorney, clarity is power. Clarity is power. Like, I know what I need to do. I know what I'm being measured on, and I know every single week where I stand. Right. So where we have tended to overinvest and spend a bunch of time on is simplified reporting that has, of course, gotten more complex over time on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis that allows us to very quickly understand where we are off track and why. I think another misconception about reporting is that things that are going well should be talked about. I have almost no interest in things that are talking about things that are going well, not because I don't want to congratulate people, but that's not a good use of everyone's time, right? Where I want to focus on is, where are we struggling? Where are we challenged? Let's dive deep into that and figure out kind of how to do it. So we have meetings that kind of start at the top of each organization, both Casablanca and Trailborn, every single Monday morning. And that meeting is structured the way that EOS, if you're familiar with
Yeah, yeah.
operating system. Yeah. So we run like a
We use
traction.
something called 90. It's very similar.
Yeah, exactly. So we have like an L10 meeting where we start, we go through quarterly rocks, we go through our KPIs, we go through customer employee headlines, and we start with 5 minutes of just personal, whatever we do this weekend,
Yep.
kind of how we doing, which sounds so trite and forced, but just is so great. And then we get into kind of issue, dispute, and resolution, which is like, what are our problems? What are our challenges? And how do we kind of fix? These are always problems. They're always challenges. It's just kind of like, how do you approach them? I love the problem and the challenge stuff. I'm like, let's go, like, let's get into it. I'm less interested in kind of the monotony of the reporting. But on an asset by asset basis, like the traditional hotel reporting, we get reports every week, but we're diving deep every month and every quarter. And the monthlies are a little bit different than the quarterlies. And then we have our kind of annual business plan and budgeting. I think the daily and weekly reporting, I think, is really important just to have a pulse on your business. I think to be a great investor, you have to understand what's happening in the business. You have to understand where things are going wrong. You have to understand why a GM is a great GM. You know, why is Nicholas a great GM? What is he doing specifically that makes him great? Where does he excel? Where, do we want to work with them on X, Y, and Z on whatever it might be? I think that like helps to understand, because then when you go in and you assess these assets, to your point, these hotels businesses. I mean, you gotta go in, you gotta understand the business, you gotta underwrite the business. I think a common misconception of hotel business is that hotels are similar. Every hotel is much more different, I think, than even I typically expect when you start underwriting. Oh, this is just like, no, it's always unique. It's always a little bit different. There are, of course, consistencies. There's pattern recognition, which is like why our business exists, to have that pattern recognition, deploy capital behind it. But every hotel is unique. And I think really having that insight to make better decisions, not to look over someone's shoulder and ask them 1,000 questions every day, but to really develop that pattern recognition and be in it, not get too far away from it. Because, one of the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about is my job basically changes every 6 months when you have a fast growing business. Every 6 months, you're sitting there saying, okay, what am I actually supposed to be focused on? What am I thinking about, or excuse me, not thinking about, that I need to be thinking about? And how close am I to the business? Because I like to be close. I just think it's important to be close to the business, and you can get pulled away really kind of quickly as the business grows. And you have to balance that, right? You have to balance that. When I started, I had the naive thought that I could do everything and there were unlimited hours in the day and I could
Yep.
just work every single hour of the day. That was an idiotic thought, and it's like not real. It's not the case. But, being able to have insight and leverage where you're not in it every single day and understand exactly what's going on, and then free yourself up to think about the things that no one else is thinking about, especially the challenges and problems that are coming around the corner, is sort of the balance that, that my business partner, Mike, and I dealt with as we kind of build this business and lead it today. And we certainly haven't been perfect, but we're doing the best we can.
In some ways, 3 and 4 star hotels from an experience standpoint are harder to execute than 5-star luxury hotels. Because with luxury hotels, it's all about people. Every hotel, it's always about people. And you can just throw a bunch of people at a problem, right? In a luxury hotel. But in a 3 and 4 star hotel, you might not have the staffing level that you would have at that type of hotel. So, what are the things that you've thought a lot about and the ways that you've learned to create experiences and moments for people at that 3 and 4 star level? Obviously, design is one, but what are the other things that you're doing with a staffing level that's limited that compared to something bigger?
It's a great question. I feel like all the luxury people I talk to say, "Oh, like 4 star must be so hard." All the 4 star people think luxury is so hard. So it's always sort of this like kind of funny dynamic. But
It's all hard. That's the
it's all
trick.
hard.
It's all hard.
It's all so hard. The thing that we found, I think that is most has been, I didn't necessarily think about when we started our business, but has been very powerful, is being able to have a system to identify ambitious people who are working at the property level, who want to make a little bit of extra money and work longer hours, to be the programming person who gets there in the morning to set up the chairs on the beach, or to, you know, basically stay after work and go work on the catamaran to serve drinks, whatever it might be. That has been such a huge unlock because these people are really talented. There's nothing more rewarding than finding talented people who are ambitious, who care about your business and want to contribute, and you get an opportunity to kind of elevate that way. It doesn't work every single time, but it works much more frequently than I would have thought. And in our very lean staffing model is very powerful, right? Because we say in half of our assets, we don't have AGMs. So, these are like the GMs
The
really
GM's a
are.
working GM. Yeah.
Yeah, the GMs are working GMs. These are not like sitting in your office GMs. They're working front desk shifts. They're inspecting rooms. You really got to kind of be that type of GM. And our GMs are incredible for that reason. I mean, they work hard and they run a tight business. And each business is a little bit different, and each customer is a little bit different. And in some cases, guests can be demanding and difficult. And these GMs are working hard to make sure even that guest leaves the hotel and is leaving a good review. So I think finding young, ambitious people in the 4 star hotel business with a mass affluent customer has been really powerful. I think it's also finding kind of commercial GMs who really can understand like enough about sales and revenue management, but can also know enough about kind of the guest experience. GMs who come up from kind of a front of house perspective really understand that guest experience and that guest touch, but getting them to really understand the revenue management side of it and how we drive revenue and margin outside of the rooms, which is such an important piece of the resort business, right? F&B, which no one likes to talk about, is a huge part of our business.
Yep.
It's a trench warfare business, just like the rest of hospitality, but somehow even harder. And it's a really tough business to be good at and deliver a consistently good product, and to make sure that front of house is talking to back of house and you're really driving margin in and around not just F&B, but also events and catering and experiences that sit outside of that. That's the beauty and the challenge of the resort business. There's a lot of money you can get outside of the rooms.
Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned the welcome letter, which I've seen a welcome letter, but mine doesn't have a Spotify playlist and like road trip, directions and cool spots. I mean, some cool spots, but your example was great. A lot of those things, OS&E included, the branding, these touch points can really allow a hotel or a property to hit way above their weight class or kind of overcome other things that maybe you don't have or you can't afford to do. Talk about how thoughtful you are around those elements and why those are important.
I think our guests will be the ultimate judge of like how thoughtful we are and whether that thoughtfulness is sort of, creates value for them and sort of outperforms. I think one of the processes that we really dive deep on that I mentioned, not by name, but is the field guide. And the field guide and the brand experience guide are really kind of two of our guiding documents internally. The field guide is like, let's go find as a team the hikes that no one knows about, the coffee shop that just opened, the boat rental spot that's on the right side of the lake so you can get over to the waterfall. It's all of that stuff. And that it's like, it sounds like table stakes and it should be, but it's sort of not. And
No, it's not.
I'm not entirely sure why, but when we got into this business, I just wanted to feel like I was talking to someone who had lived there for 20 years. I just wanted to emulate that. And that's really what the field guide is. The brand experience guide is really everything from the scent to the playlist to the sense of arrival and what you see and what we're going to kind of try and push you towards, whether that's buying a t-shirt and a hat to go on the beach, whether that's buying a drink, whatever it might be, how guests spend money and how that experience shapes them, their spending money outside of the rooms that they've effectively already paid for, is really kind of two of our guiding documents. And there's probably 4 or 5 others, which we should probably consolidate into one giant document. And we'll do that at some point. But, that really kind of guide the different stages of discussion around what are we doing here and why. The biggest issue I think that any hotel business has is what is winning and defining winning in any repositioning of a hotel. People walk into a hotel and say, I think I have the idea of what winning is here. But aligning a team across, and this, Jake, from your products, like 30 to 40 people to understand like a crystal clear what is success here. And success can be, 4-star is a colloquial and easy way to describe our product, but in some ways like means nothing, right?
Yep.
Because you have to get really granular on what that actually is. Do we want the rooms to be the same quality as public spaces? Do we want the bar outside to be the same quality as a restaurant? People assume that everyone's on the same page, and oftentimes no one's on the same page, which leads to confusion and change orders and different. And so one of my big focuses early on, and we learned this the hard way of the many things in a lot of ways, getting everyone in the room in person to understand what the vision is. And maybe we tweak that vision a little bit. Like we're open-minded to being wrong all the time. And I think just getting on that same page and the vision, it's so powerful because then people can ultimately have executive judgments, like make the decisions around, okay, I understand the vision. This bowling alley doesn't need to be the bowling alley at the Montage, but like it still needs to be a bowling alley that would fit in Jackson Hole, right?
Right.
So it's kind of creating scale of judgments, right? They're aligning on vision. But we saw in the early days, like everyone's got their own ideas and like it's almost comedy, like how different those ideas are if people are left to their own devices. It's just crazy. So getting that alignment, I think, is really important in kind of figuring out how to navigate this stuff and using the documents I mentioned to really be not just thoughtful, but like unified. I think so much of where brands have resonance is when they're unified, when you feel like you're getting hit from every direction in all of your senses, that sight, that smell, it's everything. Whether it's the feel, the sheets, what you see when you hear when you walk into the room, what the music is playing, the view, everything about it, you just keep getting hit and hit and hit and hit with the same things over and over again. That is that like 4-star outdoor adventure experience brand that is Trailborn, and every little piece and people don't notice things that we like have spent a huge amount of time on, and then they notice things that are even smaller than that. And so just trying to catch every guest in their moment in the things that they notice and using that to shape their experience and just remind them of kind of the pillars of who we are around design, around being the center of gravity, around being your kind of field guide and your guide in these markets, I think is where you can really sort of start to create a brand.
I want to talk a little bit about the capital side of the business because you have two businesses. You have the hotel business, Trailborn, maybe some other things, but Trailborn, and then you have Castle Peak, which is the capital formation, asset management, investment side of the business. And if you go on your website, you click the values. By the way, they're really cool. I like all the values. And the first one is investment returns. That's the main goal. And you're also on the one side building this amazing brand, which probably has a lot of equity value on its own. How at the early stage, it's easy if you have like one first and then the other one kind of comes, but you built them both at the same time. So how did you figure out how to balance the fine line between investment returns over here, but then, making this brand and doing all this cool brandy stuff, which might not deliver returns today? How do you make that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's complicated. I'll try and kind of boil it down. One thing I would say is that in the luxury space, I don't think you can do it. I think it just has to be together. Once you get below luxury, what happens is that, we created Trailborn as a tool to create value for our investors. It has now become something more than that. But that was the original idea, which is that we have a very specific strategy. We have views on how we can make money. We want to maximize the probability of success. So let's do this ourselves because we do not think the third-party property management companies will really pay attention to us in a way that is kind of in line with our pace and our intensity around execution.
Well, by the way,
And
most people I think about it like, I want to build this cool brand. How am I going to pay for it? You actually thought about it the opposite way.
we thought about it the opposite way. And I think it's also important when you start these businesses to share in the profits on both sides of the business with your investors, which we did. And you can't have one part of the business where investors are involved in and one not. Investors are involved in every part of our business. They see everything, and we
Okay.
are like very transparent and blunt. And we'll send investor letters saying like, we think we're doing a good enough job at this. We think we're doing a terrible job at this, right? And I think people are, kind of like, you know, a bit taken aback sometimes by that kind of assessment. But I just think it's a really honest assessment. It holds us accountable to say like we can always be better in certain areas and has visibility across the business, across both businesses, and you're kind of sharing the profits on both sides. And then of course you said like these brands become valuable because you got 5 public companies who, in my view, really have no interest in creating these brands really anymore.
They don't.
And they have a cost of capital where if I was CEO of one of those companies, I wouldn't do it either. It just doesn't make any financial sense. Their cost of capital is really compelling, and they can buy these brands and scale them in a way that allows them to net buy them at revenue multiples that just get blended down and down and down and down as they scale these things and plug them into their machines, their development machines, which are the most powerful in the world. So yeah, we've been our kind of principles on that topic have been share, be transparent, and kind of bring everyone along the journey across both businesses.
So you just raised a $300+ million fund. I think it was your first fund. So that's unreal to start. But then you also did it, I think, actually, in a time when it was probably the most difficult capital raising period I've seen in the past 20+ years. What did you learn through that experience about capital formation and raising capital?
Yeah. I think so. We raised $100 million fund, which was our first fund. This $300 million was our second fund. And I think good creative ideas with thoughtful, real execution plans, I think tend to attract capital. And so what we did for the second fund was we had a seed asset, which is the Jackson Hole asset that we recently bought, really to clarify this versus talking about something sort of in the abstract, saying this is a type of deal where it's like, this is the deal. And this is going to be the first deal in the fund. And most likely one of the larger investments in the fund. Here's how we would think about that. Here's how we think about the issues that we're going to face. Here's how we think about where we're kind of in fat pitch territory, and really kind of brings to life how this stuff actually works. Then we can go out to Jackson and say, here it is. Here's what we're talking about. And people say, oh yeah, okay, interesting. And people have questions and concerns and, all sorts of things, but it really, I think, clarifies the process. I think the key learning that we had is that, in a moment that was really difficult to fundraise more broadly, when you have a seed asset and you set the fund up in a way where you're aligned, in a really outsized way, and say, I've got, my entire net worth in this business and alongside you guys, I think that's also powerful. But I would say those are kind of our 2 learnings. And I would say lastly, like in this type of environment, hospitality in these markets is pretty attractive for the right investors, whether they're concerned about inflation, whether they're concerned about volatility, whether they're concerned about interest rates. I think, not for everyone, but we were fortunate to engage with a handful of investors who I felt had a really interesting kind of compelling view around where the world was going and how, Jackson Hole and what we do fits into that.
Yeah, it was interesting. We just bought the White Barn Inn in Kennebunkport, and I thought that the capital raise on that was much easier than other deals we've capital raised for in the past couple of years, because I think the hotel is one of a kind, very unique, and maybe that's what you're getting at, and investors see that and appreciate it. How did you kind of meet your investors? How did you go about raising capital? There's a variety of ways to do it. I'm always interested how other entrepreneurs do it.
Yeah, we did it the old fashioned way. We just pounded on the table, picked up phones, sent a bunch of cold emails. And I think probably got a little bit lucky as everyone does in these processes. But we just hustled it, and we just hustled it like 23 hours a day, as long as we could do it. for about 4 months. And so it's a grueling process, and it's a difficult process. And I said, like, everyone needs a little bit of luck in these processes. You need a couple lucky breaks, in a cold email that someone responds to that they might have not responded to. They're on the road. And I think also, from our first fund, just making sure to kind of cultivate those relationships and talk to people when you don't need anything from them, right?
Hmm.
Just to say,
Yep.
I think there's like a really special bond, by the way, between, from our first fund and our second. When you're starting a business, the people who back you in the beginning, who say, I trust you, we just take that gesture so seriously because there's so many options out there, right? Like, Blackstone is great at what they do. For example, to pick the biggest, putting your money in these Blackstone real estate funds has tended to be a reasonably good outcome. And those guys are the smartest in the world. We're fighting to get a tiny, tiny share of that real estate capital and bring it to us. We feel we're unique in both the base real estate returns that we have, and then some of the convexity we have from OpCo, and then the strategy and kind of execution of that. But we make no mistake about it, to even earn the right to have a conversation with some of these large organizations about raising capital from them. Even that, we feel you have to work for just to earn the right for the conversation, let alone ask them for your trust or capital. But I think maintaining good relationships with our fund one investors and making sure that we're communicating with them, not just when we need something, but when we want to be proactive and just tell them what's happening, the great and the not great. I think that probably helped and added a little bit of momentum as well.
So when you're thinking about a great investment returns, what ultimately does that mean to you, and over what time horizon are you trying to do that?
Yeah, I think for hospitality, I think depending on the risk profile and the value add nature of the deal, I think it really needs to be from the mid teens to the high teens. I think like low teens for hospitality, I just don't think it's compelling risk reward. I think there are lots of other opportunities out there where you can take much less risk and get low teens returns. So, it's the two sides of hospitality. You're taking more risk, but like you can really get that outsized reward. And I think on the low end, I'll talk about kind of the mid-teens types assets where you're buying an asset, and the uplift comes more from a construction light, I'll say, kind of repositioning and operational kind of fixing. And then on the more heavy kind of construction and development type opportunities, I really do think you need those high teens returns net.
Yep.
Um, to investors. I just think that's kind of where the market prices today, and I think it's the right way to price it. The only issue that happens is sometimes hospitality just gets put into one bucket, and I think there is real variation within hospitality in terms of buying
Yeah.
stabilized assets where it's mostly operational uplift versus like these more heavy value add stuff. And it's almost like everyone assumes that every single hospitality deal is like a heavy value add deal, and it's like sometimes they're just not. But I think generally, like, you know there's a lot of people doing a lot simpler things in hospitality. You can generate kind of low double digit returns. And I think that the premium for hospitality needs to put you in that kind of mid to high teens net, depending on the deal.
We've talked about team a little bit, but in hospitality, the team is everything. And a lot of times you don't have the capital, or you can't afford it, or maybe you're not there yet. I think you've made significant forward investments in both sides of the business in people. What was kind of the driving reason for that? And then, like, how do you actually, pay for that? Like, how do you make it work?
Yeah. So I think just because we had sat in the institutional seat before, in my case at TBG, we have seen kind of the other side of this, like how much these businesses take to get off the ground,
Yeah.
and have worked with, some really pretty amazing, had the privilege of working with some pretty amazing entrepreneurs who had gone through that process, and everything costs more and takes longer, not just in renovating a hotel, but in terms of actually building a company. And so the way we capitalized it up front was we put a little bit of extra cash in the balance sheet to make sure that we could hire the people that we wanted to hire. Not to say that we have, tons of budget lying around, but like, we kind of did this in a way that just allowed us to capitalize ourselves up front. We put cash in the balance sheet of the company when we raised our first fund to make sure that we weren't, in a position where we wanted to hire someone we couldn't do it. There was a huge learning process for us as to figure out who are the right types of people that we want to hire and where do they come from. I think we've gone really, really deep on figuring out, and then the second piece is our process for figuring out who people actually are, right? Like really knowing people. And I think everyone has been humbled by the interview process where you spent days with this person and on the last day, they say something. You're like, oh, that's interesting. Like maybe we should double click on that.
Yep.
You're like, oh wow, this person is like different than what I thought. Not like
Yep.
bad, but just different, right? Like they don't really do that. And we kind of thought that they were going to do that here. Right. It's right person, right seed. And, in terms of people, we have learned so much, Jake, in terms of kind of how to assess people, how to scope roles, how to really interview people to like understand who they are and to show vulnerability in yourself to really bring people out so you can understand the type of human being that they are, not just the type of professional. I always feel that employers are almost a bit reckless in hiring people because it's almost like a lot of employers like, yeah, hey, like we'll see if this works. This person's like uprooting their life. This is their livelihood. This is their passion. Like you can't just do that. And so I think I know how this company works, of course, better than a prospective candidate. And so it is our job and on us to really explain to them, the goods and the not goods about this company, where we are not firing all cylinders that we should be. And maybe part of this role that they've done in the past that they're not going to do here because we have someone else. So whatever it might be, just being super honest and transparent with people about where we think they'll fit and why, and like getting a reaction to that, I think is so important. Um, and then there's just like lots of non-traditional questions that you can ask that
Like
really,
what?
it's almost more, I wish I had like a formula for you, but it's like you have to start, with things like if I called your friends in high school and asked them about you, like, what would they say? It's the two follow-up questions after that that
Yeah.
start to like unpack stuff. If I pulled all of your prior bosses and said, like, what are the greatest things about you and what are the worst things about you? Like, what would they say? And sometimes it's not what they're actually saying. Sometimes it's what they're not saying. Right. And there's just so many different, I used to think in the early days, God, we got to have the 5 questions that we always ask. But it's about, I wish it was that simple. And as in everything, it's like, you have to dig and like feel it out. Right. The same way that you kind of navigate any process, you got to like really be like, hold on. Like, tell me more about that. Or like, why do you not talk to your brother anymore? Like, what's up with that? Like, where's he? Like, what's happening with that? You just got to go deep and be sort of pretty direct and asking people about personal things. But I think pairing that with being vulnerable yourself, right? You can't just like ask people about personal things, then tell them nothing about yourself.
Right.
And I think like kind of showing people that, parts of yourself along the way that really helps them get comfortable that like you're just here to understand them and try and get to the best outcome for the company. It's almost like these interviews, they're not about me and what I want. This is like about what is the right fit for the company and for this team. And digging deep on that, it's so hard. And it's very complicated. As we've made plenty of mistakes on that front, but I think we get a little better every year. We use EOS. We use a culture assessment called Culture Index, which we swear by.
Oh
That
yeah.
really helps us understand people a little bit better and their skill sets. Huge part of the business. I mean, it's the whole game. People.
Did you ever have a business coach? Like, how did you get into kind of EOS and Culture Index? Because we had a business coach, and that's how we kind of got introduced to some of those things. But he was basically working with my dad and I and certain issues that we were having. But I'm just curious because I don't know that a lot of big Goldman Sachs, TPG are using, 90 or EOS.
Yeah, I think the thing about these tools, and I'll answer your question on how I found out about it in a second, but the thing about these tools is that it forces you to expose yourself to your entire team in a way that like I don't think these big institutions like,
No.
right? And like in EOS, it's like I'm sitting with my leadership team. It's like, Ben, what are your goals? Like, what are you doing today? Right? Like, that accountability is like refreshing. I think it is really healthy. And in Culture Index, it's like, here's where you spike and here's where you don't, right? And is that the right fit for where you're spending time or whatever it might be? In terms of how I heard about it, I have a handful of mentors who I just kind of speak to periodically. And when, you know, I think over the years in terms of, going through exactly what you were mentioning, one of them and then two of them and then three of them said, you got to do ELS or you got to try out Culture Index. And, of course I said, we don't need that stuff. Totally wrong. We
Yep.
needed that stuff and it's been so powerful. And I think really being open and vulnerable with your people about who you are and what you like to do and where you're holding yourself accountable and what you think you're good at and what you don't think you're good at, it just like creates a different dynamic. It creates a totally different dynamic where you're not meant to be a mystery to anyone, right? You really want to show people who you are.
100%. I think there's also a lot of just weird stuff that happened during COVID with a variety of movements and things like that, that kind of came into the workplace and made things like just strange or made you question things about yourself. And the hospitality environment has gotten very difficult from a people standpoint, I think, on the hotel level. So a lot of like the 90 and the EO stuff is like bringing it back to like real business. And it focuses people on what's important and not just other stuff that's not driving the business forward. And you can measure people very easily too.
You can measure people very easily. You know, we have to remember like what really matters. And it feels like whether it's 90 or less, it just tells you what really matters. There's such a propensity to spend time on things that don't matter. And it's just human nature, me included, by the way, where you're interested by something or you have a comfort level with something, you have familiarity with something, but creating systems to focus on what actually matters drives the business forward because there's so many hours in the day. I think it's just so important. It's really important. It gets you out of the noise of what's happening sort of in the world. I think a lot of what we do for ourselves and even just for myself individually is to try and like really kind of zone out and not listen to what's going on in the world and really kind of just focus on, you know, in my case, my business and my wife and two kids. It's like what I spend 99% of my energy on. And I'm still probably not doing a good enough job in both those things, but I think really trying to like push out the noise and focus yourself it's a really powerful thing.
In 5 years or 3 years, pick one. What would you rather be doing more of and what would you rather be doing less of?
I would rather be doing less from a kind of people issues perspective. You know, those issues are just tough. There's some issues that have to be dealt with someone like me. There's also issues that just don't need to be dealt with someone like me that I deal with all of that stuff today. In terms of doing more, I like pushing the envelope and figuring out what tools and expertise do we have and how can we apply that to kind of the largest possible opportunity set. And we're focused entirely on Trailborn today in a very specific type of asset class. And I think there's a broadening that can happen as it relates to our skill sets and our expertise and what we enjoy doing and really kind of being the person in the organization that's kind of at the forefront of that.
Amazing. I asked all the guests on the podcast like a similar closing question. Outside of your portfolio, what is your favorite hotel? You don't have to pick one. There's a few.
I think there's mine are a tie. Il San Pietro and Positano, I think is just like the old Italian, like elegant hospitality there is just really extraordinary. And I think Post Ranch Inn is right up there with San Pietro. Totally different.
It's like the
But
American version.
yeah, it is. I think Post Ranch would be happy about that sort of comparison. I don't know if San
Yeah.
Pietro would be so happy about that, but those would be my two.
Amazing. I'm actually going to Il San Pietro for dinner next week. So
Oh,
I haven't been there in a long time. I'm excited to
that
check it out.
terrace is just there's nothing like it. There's
Yeah,
nothing
for that, I
like it.
mean, you can look it up online, but it's on a cliff. I mean, it's La Dolce Vita. You feel like you're in that Talented Mr. Ripley movie. That's what it's all about.
I hope all your listeners know the movie Talented Mr. Ripley. Excellent movie.
It's a
Excellent.
vibe, like if you can kind of emulate that and package that up and make it into a hotel, that would be fun
Agreed.
without the
Agreed.
murdering and whatever killing, but
Let's delete that. Yeah, that's not the
remove
insurance.
that from the
Let's
hotel.
get rid-
The hotels have to deal with that, but not, I don't want to have one. Thanks for coming on, Ben. This is awesome.
Thanks so much. It's fun to chat with you.
Hey everyone, it's Jake here. Thanks again for joining me on this conversation. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. Lastly, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at @JWurzak. I'll see you in the next episode.
Jake Wurzak is the founder and CEO of Dove Hill Capital Management. All opinions expressed by Jake and his guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Dove Hill Capital Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not reflect or represent real estate, financial, or investment advice.